Good morning, everyone. Stephen D. back. I've had a little extended break, but today it's over, and I want to talk to you about something that's far larger than election fraud, something that's far larger than, corporations buying our elections. I want to talk to you about American evil. And make no mistake, we are, at this point in time, an empire, and it's an empire that has committed grave crimes against humanity. And I don't just mean recent crimes. It's very easy to look at George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, the lies that were told to pull us into Iraq. But and it's very easy to focus on Hillary Clinton right now and her policy of her essentially her adoption of the policy of the Bush administration in terms of the Middle East and increased military assistance to our allies to fight terrorism. But it's a much larger problem, and one that goes back far longer in history than many people realize. The system itself, our entire system, since the end of World War II, has been dominated by both a military-industrial complex and also by an increasing and relentless pursuit of power and money and resources by multinational corporations. And people don't realize that, we talk about, regime change. We didn't used to be that way. No, this is not true. America's been in the regime change business for decades. Look back in the 50s. Iran. We went in and essentially toppled a democratically elected government with the help of the British and installed a dictator, Shah of Iran, a man who created his own secret police force, murdered thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, we don't know how many people. About as villainous a person as you could anticipate, simply because we wanted to ensure that British and America controlled those oil resources and that the Russians had no possibility of control. And look back at the Vietnam War itself. Again, totally unnecessary, unless you look at it in terms of what did our military want, what did our arms contractors want. They wanted to be able to produce weapons. And yes, that was in the height of the Soviet Union and the United States competition and conflict around the world called the Cold War. But, what were we fighting about, really? We were fighting for the right to exploit the rest of the world. They put it in terms of, it's ideological. It's God versus atheism. It's communism versus free enterprise, freedom versus authoritarianism. And yet during the 50s, we were putting people in jail for refusing to testify, destroying their careers, their livelihoods. It's not recent, people. And Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, yes, I believe that they are deeply involved in this system. But whether they had come about or not, the system itself would have come up with somebody to push the same things. Even our, supposedly sainted Jimmy Carter as president was deeply involved in promoting wars around the globe. If you just think about the number of countries in Central and South America in which we have helped overthrow regimes or installed dictators, and you can just tick off the list. Colombia, Peru, Venezuela, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. We invaded Grenada, of all places. To what end? And so it's important to remember this is not a new phenomenon we're facing here. The wars in the Middle East are not a new phenomenon. Our corporations seeking control of our government is not a new phenomenon. It's simply one in which they've now been able to obtain control of both the major political parties and have eliminated the influence of any progressive or even semi-progressive influences such as the labor movement and the union movement, which is at this point has been eradicated for all intents and purposes in terms of its power and its influence over American politics. I remember there was this great feeling of delight and victory when the Berlin Wall came down, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and we were supposed to have this peace dividend. And yet within, a very short time, barely over a decade, we were at war again. Well, actually, we fought several wars. We fought wars in Kuwait. We fought. We helped fund Iraq versus Iran. We've been constantly either at war or funding wars since the end of World War II. So it's ludicrous to say, okay, well, if the system recently has become bad. It's not recently at all. It's just become more blatant. In the past we didn't say we were for regime change. In the past we said, well, we don't torture people. In the past we claimed we were for human rights, and I suppose we still claim those things. But now it's the official policy. It's been the official policy since the Clinton administration, regime change in the Middle East. You still remember the famous interview with Madeleine Albright, in which she was asked, what was this too high a price to pay? 500,000 dead children in Iraq, and she said, well, no, the price is not too high. And this was from a supposedly humanitarian, liberal foreign policy advocate. There's a reason that we were involved in Iraq, even during the Clinton years and the Bush, both Bush regimes, and yet stood by and did nothing when there were massacres and slaughters and genocide in Cambodia and in Rwanda and in the Congo or Uganda, because there was no benefit to us there. Wherever there was a benefit, suddenly we had a humanitarian interest. There was a reason that the military analysts all claimed that Russia always was more powerful than we thought, that they were more powerful than we were. And it's systemic. It's not just one person. As much as we'd like to, say, okay, here's the villains. Here are the people that if we only got rid of them, if we eliminated them from power, if we prosecuted George Bush for war crimes, we would achieve something. That's not true. There are millions of people, millions of your neighbors, possibly, who go home every night working within this system. People in upper-level management of large multinational corporations, probably good fathers, good mothers, people that go to church, people that contribute to charities, and yet, every day, probably every day, one of them is going to work figuring out ways to, lay people off in the United States and employ people under slave labor conditions in other countries around the world. You cannot simply push this off on our elites. There's been a policy of enabling by a number of groups, social scientists who said, "Oh, money has no influence on politics," when we know of course it does. Economists who said, "Well, these policies of neoliberalism and capitalism that exploits and freedom of capital and so forth, and lower taxes will benefit everybody." Well, of course it doesn't. And whether someone believes these things or not, or simply denies them, we all belong to this culture, and it's a culture of evil. We say it's okay to go into Syria, where there was no reason, for us to get involved, and suddenly start flooding arms into an area where the moderates we're providing arms to are actually jihadist terrorists. There was no reason to go in, no humanitarian reason, and you can look up Amnesty International, finds out this is true, to go in and overthrow Gaddafi, which, yes, he was a dictator, but really we had to go in and remove him and end up with a state now that is a failed state, a state that in chaos. What purpose was there? There's a reason that Hillary Clinton, after Gaddafi was killed, came in and said, we saw, we saw, he died. And yes, that's an evil thing to say, but no more evil than all the other evil remarks and comments that others have made that have all been part of this same complex. So we're not looking at just a failed political system. We're not just looking at corporate control of our politics. We're not just looking at a military that has found any justification it can to continue to justify its existence and involve itself in wars to advance the careers of its officers, to advance their post-military careers, as often as members of lobbyists or corporate officials and major defense contractors. There's a reason, and that's because the system itself, the system of empire itself, is at its base an extremely heartless and evil one. And to point at one person and say, well, okay, if only. No, it's not if only. We're fighting a much larger fight than fight against, Trump or Hillary or anyone else that the Democrats or Republicans might have put up this year. And I hope that for those of you who first became involved in politics because of Sanders' campaign, you realize this is not a new phenomenon. What Bernie exposed is not something that is recent. This is long-term. This is long-standing. It involves lots of people. It involves people that vote for these people. It involves corporate executives and corporations, and it involves a military that its very culture demands justification for continued growth of armaments, continued war. So, is there a reason why we're suddenly ready to go attack Russia when Hillary Clinton comes into office, or at least put ourselves in a position where we have a possible conflict with Russia by installing no-fly zones in Syria, by putting weapons and military forces into the Baltic states and so forth. It's not Hillary's plan. It's the system's plan. This is how the system works. They give money to the Bill Gates Foundation. They give money to the Clinton Foundation. They give their money and claim it's philanthropy, and the justification for doing that is so that they can get favors in return. That people will forget that we're exploiting the rest of the world, that millions are dying, and that we're doing nothing, and that even in countries that are relatively stable, we're willing to go in and dismantle that stability and put millions of lives at risk simply for our own benefit. So, if there's one thing I want you to take away from today's video of me speaking, it's that this is much deeper, much more entrenched than you can possibly imagine, and it's going to take a great deal more effort than simply electing a few Bernie-crats to office. It's going to take a great deal more effort than passing a constitutional amendment to eliminate corporate personhood. And yes, these things are important, but it's going to take more than simply somehow demilitarizing our police forces, because all of those things are part of a whole, and they're all part of a system that intends to keep us ignorant, that intends to exploit us as commodities, as consumers in America, while it exploits others around the world as essentially slave laborers, all for the benefit of elites in the military, elites in these multinational corporations, the political elites. It's a very profound problem, and it is justifiably evil. So with that said, say goodbye for today. Have a great week, and I'll see you later. Take care. Stephen D.